Joining us now on the line is our legal analyst, Joe DiGenova. Joe, good day to have you here as we are running up to this big hearing tomorrow in the Supreme Court as the Supremes take up the Hobby Lobby case. It has to do with the Affordable Care Act. It has to do with contraceptives, and it has to do with a couple of companies that say, this is against our religious beliefs, and we ought not be required under the Affordable Care Act to provide some forms of contraception. Lay out the legal arguments that are likely to be discussed tomorrow.
Well, Hobby Lobby is a very unusual company. They are, while they're not a religious institution like the Little Sisters of the Poor, they are a very religious company owned by a very religious family, the Green family. The Green family is the largest holder of religious artifacts in the United States. They have a private collection that is simply stunning in its breadth and its depth. In their company, they give health insurance to all their employees. They pay their people well above the minimum wage who come and start there. They even allow for preventive contraception in their current health care policies. What they will not do, and what they have never covered, is after pregnancy abortifacious drugs like the morning after or the week after pill. They're saying that offends their religious beliefs, and they will not provide that coverage. The government says, oh, yes, you will, because we have a mandate approved by the Supreme Court of the United States that says you must provide this health care insurance or pay a tax, not a penalty. Remember, Chief Justice Roberts said it is a tax, even though it didn't start in the House and even though the President says it wasn't a tax. For them, this would be tens of millions of dollars, this penalty. And they have decided to challenge it. They're saying it violates their First Amendment freedom of religious expression. The government says we have an overwhelming governmental interest in providing post-pregnancy abortifacious medicines, and you have to provide it. Your religious interest is not sufficient. It must give way. Nobody knows how the court is going to rule in this case because it's not a religious institution. At the same time, the company and the family come pretty close to it, and whether or not the mandate can go this far, this will be the first real test of Obamacare's post-constitutional status.
Joe DiGenova, I'm torn on the issue because I lean toward wanting to side with Hobby Lobby, and I do side with Hobby Lobby on this, I believe. But then I thought about it some more, and it opens up a lot of questions. For instance, Quakers, Mennonites, many members of Pentecostal traditions, they interpret the Sixth Commandment, thou shalt not kill, to mean a ban on warfare. Should they be allowed to exempt themselves from paying federal taxes because it is against their religious belief to fund wars? Of course not. We have a religious society, but we have a secular government, and if you live in our society, you have to, participate in our secular government.
Well, there's the rub. That's that. Where is that water's edge? Where does the government end and religious freedom begin? And of course, as you know, Larry, I don't think you're old enough to remember the Vietnam War. But
let's go with that, Joe.
But during the Vietnam War, people like me who were drafted remember hearing Joan Baez at anti-war rallies tell people not to pay their taxes so they wouldn't fund the war effort. And, of course, courts ruled that people who held back money could be put in jail for it. So, those weren't religious objections. Those were political objections. But nonetheless, there are limits to religious freedom. You can't kill somebody as part of your exercise of religious freedoms. Sacrifice ended with the Mexican folks down there, the Incas.
Or apparently you can't take hallucinogenic mushrooms.
That is correct.
Well, Scalia wrote that decision.
That is correct, that there are limits to religious freedom. This, however, is different. This doesn't harm anybody else. This is an issue of whether or not the government, remember, those people wanted to do something, the government wanted to stop them. Here, the government wants to force them to do something, and they don't want to do it. The issue here is compulsion. That may be the thing that actually helps Hobby Lobby more than anything else. In all these other religious cases, the religious people want to do something, and the government wants to stop them. Here, the government wants to force them to do something, and they don't want to. That may be the one thing that tips the balance in favor of Hobby Lobby. In other words, what is the governmental action at issue here? It is a compulsion to force someone to violate their religious beliefs. Right. That's a much different issue than the old cases.
All right, so I know that you want to weigh in on this, and I've been dying to hear what your thoughts are. There was an editorial in Washington Post by someone named Hillary Krieger, who says, look, is it necessarily a bad thing that the Vincent Gray's had a little corruption? I mean, he's been all in all, she thinks he's been a pretty good mayor. But she wonders whether or not a little corruption should disqualify him for re-election. Is it really in the voters' best interest to disqualify candidates, no matter the good they've done, because of a corruption scandal or two? She asked rhetorically.
Well, what I find interesting about this op-ed piece in the Washington Post yesterday by a member of the Post editorial board, who's named Hillary Krieger, who, if you look at her resume, hasn't been able to hold a job for more than a year at a pop. This is an outrageous editorial. Let me read you the caption. Is a little political corruption all that bad? ? Now, this is at a time when the capital of the free world is in the throes of the worst political corruption case in its history, a $662,000 illegal campaign contribution from a guy who has pleaded guilty to it and named the mayor as knowingly participating in the criminal conspiracy. The city can barely run itself. It doesn't run its own courts. They're run by the federal government. It doesn't have a prison within its borders. It wants to be a state, and the clown at the Washington Post writes an editorial asking, is a little political corruption all that bad? You have to be a Class A moron, A, to do that headline, and second, to write the article underneath of it. This is the same paper that was ragging on the U.S. attorney, saying, why is it taking you so long? What in the name of God is wrong? You know what? That editorial never would have been written when the Grahams owned the paper. Now, Jeff Bezos apparently thinks it's just great to have a little crime.
But Joe they're basically saying as long as the corruption helps the city and isn't for personal gain, then
you know what? This is something that requires a shrink at the Washington Post.
Sure, he had to cheat to get into office, but at least once he got there, he was good.
Can you imagine the editor writing that headline after they have ragged on the federal prosecutor for almost 2 years?
Yeah.
Where are you going? Why aren't you bringing an indictment? Why haven't people been charged? Now, understanding all along that Jeffrey Thompson was fighting this thing all the way to the Supreme Court, and only after he lost there did he cave. That took 2 years. This is such bad journalism, such bad public policy, such incompetence at the journalistic level.
Yeah.
You have to ask yourself, what are they smoking?
The thing I always wonder is, why doesn't Joe DiGenova ever really tell us what he really thinks?
Well, as a former U.S. attorney who had to live with these morons, I suppose, calling me a racist when we were investigating, at least Ron Mason is black, for God's sakes. They can't call him a racist, but they are calling him politically motivated. No. Now, what's left? I mean, I know what's wrong with this guy. He's a vegetarian.
Listen, Joe, you hit it on the nail on the head, and it's true. Washington Post, with that editorial, they have abdicated their responsibility as to speaking truth to power here in the District of Columbia. This is a city they're supposed to actually be the watchdog for. It's ridiculous.
Joe, thank you so much.
Okay, guys, take care. Enjoy the